UBC's chapter of Saikai acknowledges that it operates on UBC's infrastructure, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Please appreciate the meaning behind the statement as we move forward with the Labyrinth podcast.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adya Mittal, and I'm an executive coordinator of Saikai, the International Honor Society in Psychology. Today on the Labyrinth podcast, we have the principal investigator from the Social Identity Lab, Dr. Tony Schmader. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really honored to talk to you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thanks so much for having me on here and giving me the opportunity to talk about what we do. I'm really excited.
Yeah. So let's get into it. So can you please explain in your words, Dr. Schmader, for the students or anyone who's listening, what is the Social Identity Lab?
Yeah, in our lab, we generally study the social psychology of self and identity through the lens of how we're affected by the social groups we belong to. So how do we define ourselves and think about ourselves and the choices we have in life based on social groups we consider ourselves a part of and the stereotypes that people attach to those groups.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm honestly, personally fascinated by how stereotypes are formed and fostered in communities. What motivated you to get into this area of study? Like, how did your lab come about?
Yeah, well, gosh, I guess the answer to that question kind of depends on how far you want to go back. I mean, when I was an undergraduate student, trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life, I knew it's funny, I knew I wanted to get a PhD and do research and maybe even, get a job at a university someday before I kind of knew what my topic would be. But eventually I became really fascinated by the idea that we're all influenced by our kind of casual participation in social contexts and how other people influence it. And that's really what social psychology is. And then I've always had a fascination and an interest with what it means to be marginalized or disadvantaged, and how the expectations that others have of us can influence and bring out the best or the worst of us, in these kind of subtle ways. And so once I realized that really that's what social psychology does, and really that's what stereotyping leads to in people, then I was kind of hooked on those topics, and went to graduate school to study under someone who was really a world-renowned expert, still is, on the topic of stigma and how people are resilient in the face of social stigma. And and then was lucky enough to get a job first at the University of Arizona, where I was on the faculty there for 10 years. So that's where I started the Social Identity Lab, and then came to Vancouver and to UBC in 2009, and the lab's continued here.
Yeah, you've come a long way. Yeah, so I was wondering, can we now talk like a little bit more specifically towards your research on stereotype threats? It's interesting to see how people behave in stereotype confirming behavior. Can you please elaborate on how your research on the topic has evolved over the years, and what are your key takeaways?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Because the research on stereotype threat, and for those who don't know, stereotype threat is defined as the threat one might experience in any situation where they're afraid, either implicitly or explicitly, they could do something to confirm a negative stereotype about their group. This was a theory that was first proposed by Claude Steele when he was at Stanford University, and he published sort of the research that provided the first evidence of this kind of phenomena in 1995, when I was a grad student, when I was I guess kind of right in the middle of my PhD. So I became completely fascinated by that theory. And when I started as an assistant professor at the beginning of my career, it was a time when actually the whole field was fascinated by the theory, but the theory didn't have an explanation. Like, no one quite understood why subtle reminders of being negatively stereotyped could lower or impair one's performance in let's say like a high stakes testing situation. And so I really sought to try to identify what the mediating mechanisms were of that effect. And whereas other people at the time were looking at things like anxiety and evaluation apprehension, I became interested in thinking about the fact that at the time there was a lot of research showing impairment in many different kinds of domains. And so I thought, well, if we look at the outcomes that people are showing, there must be some core domain general cognitive mechanism that is being affected if we can see effects show up in so many different places. And so that got me doing research showing that subtle reminders of being negatively stereotyped can impair temporarily one's working memory capacity, one's ability to kind of have executive control over their attention. And as a result, people can become, colloquially can become somewhat distracted, right? It's hard to stay focused on the task at hand. We propose kind of 3 more specific mechanisms to that people become more, kind of outside of themselves, monitoring their performance and how they're appearing to others, that they might also be experiencing heightened stress arousal that could directly impair cognitive processing, as well as just, sort of trying to then regulate and deal with the emotions and the stress, and that process of trying to, suppress these distracting thoughts and meta monitoring and stress response you might have can itself sort of absorb or hijack the same kind of attentional resources. Anyway, so I started out being really fascinated, and I haven't talked about it in a long time, so I'm still really fascinated by the way in which these mechanisms sort of work together, integrate together to sort of suck up the resources that you would need to really stay focused. But then eventually, after doing that was pretty basic science lab research, drawing on what we knew from like cognitive stress and health and so forth. I then thought, well, okay, the paradigm for studying those effects were really about test performance, but life is not test performance. Like life is much richer than that. And so then I became really interested in, what are the other places where people experience stereotype threat? At the time, I started doing a lot of research looking at young women facing negative stereotypes about their math ability. And so then it led me to kind of think about, well, what happens, once you do embark on a career in math or science where this is part of your daily life? How does stereotype threat then manifest outside of just a timed test? And so that got me really interested in the interpersonal processes that take place between people and how stereotype threat manifests in interpersonal interactions. We did, for example, a really novel and interesting study where we had science faculty agree to be part of this research, where they wore a device that would come on intermittently and record ambient sound during their workday. It would come on, maybe every 50 minutes and record 50 seconds of sound that then research assistants would meticulously transcribe so we could code what was going on. And so we were really looking at their conversations with their colleagues. And one of the things that we found were very different patterns of relationships between what men and women were talking about in their daily lives as scientists and how engaged they were with their work. And for men, it was a really straightforward pattern where the more they were talking about their research with their other male colleagues, the more they said they were engaged in their work. And for women, we found this really interesting pattern that was the reverse of that. The more they were talking about research with their male colleagues, the less engaged they said they were with their work. Now, it was completely a correlational study, and so that wasn't conclusive of anything, but it was consistent with an idea we had at the time that something might be happening in conversations that men and women have together, or any kind of marginalized group and advantaged group might have, in a threatening domain that could bring that threat to mind and might lead to sort of general feelings of disengagement, general feelings like this just doesn't, just doesn't feel like it's as exciting as it might be if you were a part of the advantage group.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I've seen this like even in like classrooms. I think it's like a very interesting pattern to see like if like I know like I read about like if like companies foster like more inclusive environments, like like they feel more engaged, women feel more engaged. Like I've seen that in classrooms as well. Like the more inclusive professors are, like the more engaged students become. So yeah, it's like very interesting how like these things connect with each other. Um, Okay, so getting back
Yeah.
on topic.
I mean, I can just follow up on that more precisely because I mean, we're doing a lot of research now kind of on the topic of inclusion in exactly, with exactly what you have in mind, these kind of social patterns that I was talking about in this kind of specific example of the specific study that we did sort of suggests that when you're part of a social network that feels included, then all of those extra processes that I talked about before, right? The monitoring of yourself and the trying to regulate distracting emotions or anxiety or ruminations you might be having, or just the overall stress level, that all of that goes away if you are in a situation that feels completely supported. So in other research that we've been doing, really following this line of looking at men's and women's experiences in science or STEM settings, what we see is using daily diary studies. When women tell us that, just to give you a bit of a sense of the method. So in these studies, we might ask men and women to report on conversations that they've had with other colleagues over a 10-day time period. And then we look in those conversations for, how much people rate that during that conversation they felt, supported, respected, accepted, and so forth. And, we generally find that women report being more conscious of their gender in everyday social situations and work situations than men do. So that's kind of our measure of now we call it social identity threat rather than just stereotype threat, because it's a bit more broader than just feeling like you might confirm a negative stereotype. And, so women generally report more social identity threat, again, defined in these studies as, I'm concerned that people are seeing me through the lens of my gender at work, for example. But when women tell us that in their daily conversations with their male colleagues, they feel completely accepted and respected and supported and so forth, that gender difference disappears. So again, that idea that if you do have inclusion and if you do have mutual respect in your social network, then you don't see the same kind of pernicious effects of stereotype threats. So it's not at all a given that people experience these experience threat in just all situations. And again, that's what's really exciting, I think, from a social psychological perspective, is that it really points to the idea that you can change situations to foster that inclusive type of phenomenon.
Yeah, like do you think like having more like female colleagues in like a work environment would also help? Like can it reduce that threat?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. It's funny thing in some of the surveys we've been doing more recently, where we actually we sample people working, in professional environments, and we ask them, what the gender ratio is of their organization, because we were curious, just as you are with your question, to know whether or not the representation of women in these settings would itself be a predictor. It turned out it doesn't explain any of the variance in the studies that we've measured. So, although intuitively it feels like it should help, we don't have any evidence that it matters one way or the other, quite honestly. If anything, what we've been measuring more recently are people's perceptions of the percentage of men and women in their organization who are allies to the topic of gender inclusion. And I'm guessing you could study this with other contexts as well. We just happen to study it with gender. And what we find is that feeling like you have a high percentage of women who are allies in your organization, again, doesn't really predict much of anything for women. But seeing that you have or feeling that you have a high percentage of men who are allies to gender inclusion is hugely predictive. It predicts greater organizational commitment. It predicts lower social identity threat, as I've talked about. So that comes with a lot of benefits, just like we've been saying.
Yeah, that's honestly like I can ask you a million questions on a million questions on this topic because it's so interesting. Just to see how these things like how they like come from for like decades this has been like used to like create like stereotypes against people like with test performance scores and stuff, and now in like naturalistic settings how like this affects like our cognitive processing. um so I know you're also the director of Engendering Success in STEM. Can you please expand how you got interested in that? Like I think you've like talked a lot about how you're doing this kind of research, but like how did you get like become part of the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as you can sort of see from what I've described so far, once we started trying to understand social identity threat as it's experienced in more naturalistic field settings, in these more survey studies, we stepped outside of the lab where we were doing these sort of experiments into more field-based studies of men and women in STEM. We then realized there was really an opportunity. I mean, I every time I would be asked to give a talk on this research to professional communities, I mean, quite honestly, just the amount of gratitude that people felt in first of all, in just having a label to what they have experienced was really eye-opening for me, I would say. That it's easy to kind of, especially early in your career, everything feels like an academic exercise, right? You go from being a student to a grad student to an early career researcher, and it's a very academic pursuit. You're trying to get a job, you're trying to get publications, you're trying to get tenure and so forth. And then when you actually start sharing what you've learned with others who are directly affected by it and realize that, just realize that there was such a thirst for the knowledge that our field was generating, that it became clear that there's really an opportunity to create partnerships between researchers and, in our case, kind of organizations that have such a vested interest in trying to promote, in this case, sort of women's entry and engagement in STEM contexts, that we wanted to develop a consortium that would really facilitate those kinds of partnerships. And I looked around and realized there were lots of great researchers here in Canada who were social psychologists, developmental psychologists, organizational psychologists, or STEM experts themselves, who had some expertise in social identity threat, the topic I've been talking about, or in, how do you reduce prejudice and bias through intergroup contact and fostering close relationships across group bounds, or the topic of implicit bias. And so I pulled together a team of researchers. I think now we've kind of grown to maybe 15 or 16, depending on how you count, mostly across Canada, although we have some spread in other countries or who've left Canada for other countries, but we still keep them in our team. And then we have about, I think, 36 partnering organizations now. And this is funded by a SSHRC partnership grant. That's a 7-year project where we just completed the halfway mark, actually. And what we're doing is kind of devoting our efforts towards research aimed at trying to understand and measure the effectiveness of theory-based interventions designed to promote women's inclusion in STEM across a developmental pathway. So Andy Barron, who's also here at UBC, I don't know if you had a chance to interview him yet, but Andy's great. So he spearheads Project Climb, that's focused on the early development of implicit bias at a young age in partnership with Science World as our local, science organization. We have another team spearheaded by Steve Spencer and Steve Wright that focuses on more like adolescent kids who are sort of at this age where they might be participating in summer science camps. That's where they're recruiting participants and trying to foster, how do you instill respect for what girls can contribute in STEM to young boys, as well as then foster a sense of self-efficacy and possibility for young girls. So they're working with interventions with that age group. We have another team out of University of Toronto with Sonia Kang and Liz Page Gould, who are using more of a stress and coping framework to look at the way in which young women and men transition to their first career in engineering after completing an engineering degree at U of T and now at McMaster, which is another partner organization for them. And then Hillary Bergseeker at the University of Waterloo and I have been doing interventions, trying to figure out if we can use some of the theory and the ideas that I've been talking about already, package them into an intervention that's basically a diversity and inclusion training, and test the effectiveness in fostering greater allyship and reducing social identity threat for men and women working in science and engineering contexts. So anyway, so that's what we've been doing. So it's a very broad and very applied type of work.
Yeah, it's honestly fascinating. I think in like my social psychology class, I think in like last year, with like Simon Lolio, I know like you know him.
Yep.
Yeah, like he like showed us, like he looked up like doctor, engineer or something, and like it was just men, like just men would show up on like Google like images. Yep. And that was like so fascinating to see how like we have this image of like a doctor or like a nurse or like an engineer in our head, and it's like very gender based. So yeah, that was my little takeaway from what you just said.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because Simon, before Simon became the superstar instructor that he is today in our department, he started as a postdoc working on this project. So yeah, so he and I worked together to kind of to do that little trick that you talk about, like doing a Google image search on engineer and sort of counting up the number of male faces that you see. So it's actually something that we sometimes show in the workshops that we do, in fact, because it's it's such an easy demonstration of the way in which our culture still kind of subtly instills in us these implicit associations that if you think science, you think engineering, what comes to mind is most likely a male rather than a female.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I took his courses, like honestly love him. He's like
he's fantastic. He's very fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, so honestly, I can talk about this for hours. So let's redirect to some other interesting research that's being done at your lab. I know you're also actively researching why there is this underrepresentation of men in communal roles like daycare or nursing, and how that in turn impacts women. Could you tell us a little bit about your findings and how you plan on investigating this phenomena further?
Yeah. And again, it's all of this kind of grows out of everything I've been talking about, because once we started looking at the way in which stereotypes constrain women's choices and experiences in STEM contexts, it just became a natural question to sort of think about, well, men are constrained by stereotypes as well. And if anything, might even be more constrained about them. So we became really interested in the idea that men are stereotyped as not being communal, and wanting to understand that more, because it in part because it really is part of understanding what holds women back. I mean, so much of what holds women back in professional contexts is the expectations that are placed on women as being primary caregivers for children and older family members and so forth, not to mention the kind of career choices that men and women are more likely to make, self-segregating into different occupations. And so as we were doing all this research trying to understand gender inequality, it seemed silly to only be looking at it focused on women and not focused on men. And so we became very interested in this idea, and documenting that, for example, people just really accept the idea that men are just less communal. Like no one, people just accept it as a fact. They don't, this isn't our research, this is other people's research by Amanda Diekman and Alice Egley. They don't think it's going to change. They think that those stereotypes will continue 50 years in the future, whereas they think that women are equally sort of agentic and goal oriented as men now. But yeah, so we became really interested in that. We have a paper actually that's under review right now. This collaboration with Kylie Hamlin. That's a meta-analysis of the types of studies that she's done with babies. This might seem like an odd leap, but she has this research, using puppet paradigms to show that, from a really early age, babies have a preference for pro-social actors. And we thought, well, that's really interesting. Has anyone ever looked at sex differences on that task? Because if men just are less communal, then maybe they don't have that same kind of preference. Maybe they're not as attuned to pro-social behavior from infancy. And so, sort of collaborating with her and with another colleague who had recently done another meta-analysis of these data, but hadn't looked at gender. We meta-analyzed those data, and there's just zero difference between boy and girl babies in pro-social preference. So it's clear we all come into this world, having some sense of what it means to be a helper, and there's no sex difference there. But in some of our other research, we've shown that by age 6, boys are already less likely to describe themselves as kind and helpful compared to girls. And that predicts the degree to which they think when they grow up, they're going to prioritize family over career, for example. So, it's not conclusive evidence that these things are socialized, but it's certainly consistent with the idea that that cultural stereotypes might be, socializing young boys and girls from an early age of who values being communal. And then in another recent project, we have cross-national data from almost 20,000 undergraduate students across almost 50 different countries, where we show sort of a reliable gender difference among young adults in valuing being communal, so being kind, caring, and compassionate. That is just, those values are more strongly endorsed by women than by men, but there are cross-national differences in that tendency to value communion as well. And the differences, interestingly, are larger. The gender gap is larger in more economically developed and individualistic countries. We don't have all of the answers as to exactly why that is, but at first it seems a bit paradoxical, because those also tend to be countries that are higher in gender equality. So the same countries that are promoting sort of equality for women have these very large gender differences in communal stereotypes that predict differences in men's and women's interest in communal careers like nursing and education.
Well, yeah, for sure. I'm from India, which is very collectivistic, and if you go to not where I'm from North India. But when you go in the South, you see that the more kind you are, the more it's very patriarchal still. So the male head figure is supposed to be kind and compassionate, and that's associated with being a leader and being the family leader.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's so fascinating, right? That somehow in Western individualistic countries, we've separated those things out, that to sort of promote one's own goals, or to be dominant to have sort of dominance or status in society, is to is to not be communal in some sense. And one of the projects we want to work on, this is with Kate Block, who recently finished her PhD last year and is now a postdoc at New York University, and was formerly an undergraduate, by the way, at UBC as well. But yeah, Kate's really interested in, the degree to which people see these things, communion and agency, as compatible or incompatible. Because in collectivist cultures, I think the prediction would be they seem much more compatible, right, than in individualistic cultures. And that's something else we can look at in the same data set.
Yeah, it's so different how, like, like, it's seen as like to be like the leader of the family, you're supposed to be compassionate, but like also on the other hand, it's like very natural, and like it's almost like normal for a woman to like leave her career and just like stay back and take care of the children, and while the man goes out and like feeds the family and stuff. Whereas it's also like, it's like the complete opposite.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a really important point, because these gender differences and values that we're documenting don't explain everything that's going on in terms of gender traditional roles. And so there's still a lot to be understood about what the other predictors are.
Yeah, like these are topics you can research forever, because like these are things that are happening around us. Yeah, that's why it's so fascinating. um okay, so I think we learned a lot today. If you don't mind, can we get into like the nitty gritty details of actually applying to the lab and working in the lab?
Sure.
So what is the structure of the way the lab runs? Like, do undergraduate RAs get to interact directly with you? Do you have extracurricular activities like meetings, etc.?
Yeah. We tend to have, like, I'll give you a flavor, kind of future oriented flavor of like what our lab is likely to look like next year for anyone who's listening to this and might be interested in applying. We have actually a lot of new people coming into the lab, so it's kind of an exciting time. I have a senior graduate student right now, Lucy D'Souza, who's in her finishing up her second year of her PhD. I have a new postdoctoral fellow who will be coming in from Switzerland, Krista Nader. So she'll be here for a couple of years. And then I have two new graduate students who are starting in the lab, Carmel Burkett-Chavet, who is coming up from Stanford. She's a lab manager at Stanford right now, but she'll be starting in our master's program in the fall. And then Yinqi Guo, who's currently in our lab and is my lab manager right now, is also starting in the master's program in psychology, part in my lab and part in Jason Wright's lab in our quantitative psych field. So anyway, that gives you a sense of kind of who the players are. Any given semester or term, we probably have a couple of dozen undergraduate volunteers. After people have volunteered for a term or two, we then invite people to do a directed studies or an honors thesis if they're in the honors program. And our lab meetings that happen weekly are open to anybody who wants to come, but we especially encourage anyone who's doing directed studies or honors to come to those lab meetings. And then as well to as they're working on projects with, they tend to be directly supervised by, one of the grad students or postdocs, but then periodic meetings that I will join in as well, so that we get to co-develop things together.
Oh yeah, that sounds really interesting, actually. Yeah. So yeah, it's great to know that there are so many opportunities for our undergraduates to, get involved. So that actually takes me to my next question. What's like the scope for involvement for undergraduate research assistants? Like, can they choose the research they're part of? Because I know you're researching very different topics. Do they choose which research they're part of, or is it like based on need?
Yeah, it kind of evolves over time, I would say. So in most cases, people come into the lab at the beginning and kind of get trained on a project that's already up and running, or something that a graduate student is doing and needs help with the implementation of. But as people become more senior in the lab, if you've spent a couple of terms in the lab, then there's more flexibility for developing a project that might be an offshoot to something that's going on. Ideas are always welcome for, at lab meetings or in general, like, hey, this is really interesting, I'd like to do this other thing. And, so we try to make those kind of projects work when we can. And like I said, to kind of give people the experience of having some autonomy in the work that's done. But it does take some training to get to that point, to be able to kind of think through, what would be the novel question to add to this line of research.
Yeah, and can undergraduate students, like after they graduate, still be a part of the lab?
Yeah, we do sometimes have people who, are taking, like a gap year between finishing their degree and want to stick around and volunteer in the lab. And in rare occasions, for people who've been in the lab for a long time, we sometimes have paid opportunities. Those aren't always a given, but we sometimes do. But yeah, so we usually try to make space for people who are interested in being part of the team in some way.
Yeah. What do you think are the types of attitudes or personalities that would fit best in the lab?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, given the types of things that we study, we're very interested in students who are interested in these topics more than anything else. I mean, other than that, having being intensely curious and conscientious, being a good student, but also just being creative in thinking. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's often underappreciated by people, is that research involves a lot of creativity in thinking about, what would be the unique idea to ask with respect to a line of research that no one else has asked before. And then even more importantly, like, how do you package that into a research paradigm that is designed in a way that will rule out, clear alternative explanations and will yield real advances. So I would say curiosity, creativity, and open-mindedness, inclusion, and conscientiousness are kind of the key things.
Yeah, for sure. So what are the day-to-day responsibilities of an RA?
Yeah, I have to say that can really vary depending on the kind of project that someone's getting involved with, because we've over the last year, obviously the pandemic has changed the way research happens, right? So I know that there have been some RAs working on projects that involve a lot of programming, quite frankly, because it's sort of, how do you create an online paradigm that's enriching and meaningful to be able to understand social psychological questions. But during regular non-pandemic times, we might have studies that involve people who are playing a role, playing the part of a participant in a study, rather. And so that almost takes acting experience to be able to do. I would say the general kinds of things, right, involve helping out with creating materials, reviewing materials, helping with scheduling participants if it's a study that requires that, programming things into Qualtrics. And then if people are interested, they can also often get some training in kind of data management, coding, and maybe even some analysis and so forth. People who do directed studies in our lab are also asked to write a paper over the course of 2 terms that describes the research that they're doing, and to give at least one presentation in our lab. And many students present in the UBC or psych department conferences. So like PERC, over the weekend, we had several people who are presenting from the lab.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So who's the best person to get in touch with, like to apply to the lab? Like are there GPA limitations?
Yeah, we do have an application that we ask people to fill out. So basically, anyone can email me directly, and I will just forward people along to Yingxi while she's still the lab manager, and until we find her next replacement. Yeah, I mean, we do look for people with somewhat higher GPAs, but I don't think we have a firm threshold. Usually, we take a look at what positions we are able to have openings for, and who's applied, and then do interviews from there to sort of see if there's just a good match between what people want to do and what we're looking for, given the particular types of studies we have going on.
Yeah, of course. And to like the most interesting question that I'm sure everyone wants to know, when do you guys hire?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how much we'll have happening in the summer right now, but I do know we'll definitely have positions open for the fall. But still, I would say probably during the summer will be when some of those will get filled. So anyone who wants to reach out sooner rather than later, I mean, the worst case scenario is we might just say, hey, can you check back in August or what have you? But usually we'll kind of keep information until we're ready to kind of sit down and make decisions. So but probably we're looking for open positions starting in the fall.
Oh, that's really good to know. So I think that concludes our interview today. Thank you so much, Dr. Schmader. We are so glad to have you here. I think we learned a lot today about your research and about the field of social psychology and just the way we all interact with each other. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. I think it's such a great idea to be doing this as a way for people to get to know about the research and the opportunities that undergrads have for working in the labs too.
Yeah, for sure.